Look, as far as sex work, as we call it here, and we are quite used to using the term prostitution in our general conversation. Let me first start by trying to explain how do I define that. Now, there are references to something called illicit love. Okay, in earliest sections of the Rig Samhita, we come across that. But illicit love may not be what we understand as sex work, because something that sex work denotes is there has to be a commercial angle to it. There has to be some kind of a payment in return for that. So, do we get such references where we can have a reference to somebody who is doing it for something in return for a kind of a sex activity? Um, uh, there are surer examples of it as we are moving towards what we refer to as the post-Vedic literature. But within the Vedic literature, and an overlap with Vedic literature would also be, say, the Mahabharata, we start getting references to it. I mean, the Rig Samhita will talk about somebody called Sadharini or Agru, or we have in the Atharva Ved, which is the later Vedic text, a reference to Mahanagni, which is like somebody who's bared the body for people at large, and she may be compensated for that in some way. We do start getting references to something where a woman, where the distinction between a woman for one against a woman for many, that is something that we start getting in the earliest of the literature. Let me give you an example from the Mahabharata, and a very interesting example that I am going to talk about is the one that comes in a dialogue between Pandu and Kunti, his first wife. Now, all of you may be aware of the story that Pandu was impotent, or because of a curse, or whatever reason, because of the way he was born, as we are explained in the myth, he could not reproduce. And for a very long time, even when he had become the ruler, he was feeling extremely humiliated internally because of that factor, and he decides to leave everything, and with his wife he goes into forest. And there he comes across a sage, I mean an image of a sage who is like on the tree upside down. And when he asks him the reason why it's the case, so he's told that because I have not had a lineage, I have not been able to secure my position in heaven, and this is what would happen to somebody who is without a child, without a son to be precise. So that's when it strikes him that he needs to have a son, come what may. Now it is very clear he is impotent. So he enters into an argument, a dialogue with Kunti, and wants Kunti to enter into what we refer to as a niyog relationship. That is, that there's like a temporary alliance with somebody else. He says, go to a Brahmin, and you may cohabit with him, and he would be my child, and bring back that child. So it is at that point she gets very enraged, Kunti. And Kunti is in a long dialogue with him, trying to explain, look, both of us love each other so much that one day the gods are going to be benign and things are going to settle up, and we'll have children of our own. And there's an argument back and forth. But finally, he says, look, I'm your husband, and I have the right to give you an instruction. And my instruction is that I need a son, come what may. And my kshetra, that is your womb is my kshetra, and a child will be produced, a son will be produced through that. So it is at that point when he's insisting, and she realizes there's no way out, she discloses that she's got a boon, that is a mantra from Durvasa Muni, and if she recalls that, then she can invoke any god, he would come to her, and together they can make a child. And it's something where you don't have to be there for a long time, and the child will come to you. And that is how she has the first child through Dharma, and then through Vayu and Indra. Now, coming to this point about the sex work, at some point, Pandu is very pleased, but he gets tempted. What he wants is that this kind of, children coming through this mechanism suits him perfectly fine. He says, let's have more. That is at that point, Kunti says, that look, I've given you 3 sons, but if I were to get into the 4th, I'll become Swarini. What is a wanton woman? I would be called somebody who is indulging in a relationship or in a sex act which is almost not an essential, it goes beyond the essential, and hence it is almost like I'll become a prostitute. It's the same act. Okay. The first three children have the legitimacy, and it's an act which gets a support from her husband. The fourth time when she's supposed to do it, she says, "You can't push me into it because I'll become a prostitute." Which means that at that point in time, there is a notion of who is indulging in a sex work for some purpose. I mean, there's a material return that we are talking about. So that, and in this case, it is the child, because child is almost a material return, because the child is what is going to associate you, tell you, I mean, which grant you lineage, would inherit your property, but most important than that is going to perform Pindadan. This son is going to perform Pindadan, who is going to get your place secured in heaven. So there is a form of a material return that you are talking about here, which is also interestingly linked with spirituality, because that's a space in heaven that one is trying to secure. But at the same time, and I found that just thin line dividing an act that is socially approved and an act that becomes a cause of worry for the woman who is involved in it. And similarly, with passage of time, we come across a very interesting word, and that is Panyastri. Panyastri is a woman who will be getting money in return for her services. So what we are talking about is sex as service, which is a sex as service and of course there is, because the kind of literature that we are coming across by and large, especially the Brahminical literature, there's an element of derision woven within it. But otherwise also, the point is that they're looking at it as a very, very commercial activity. And to the extent you may have studied yourself, that by the time you get into reading of Arthashastra, the state has come in, and the state is fully acknowledging, I'm talking of the Mauryan times, fully acknowledging to the extent that there is somebody who's supervising the activity and ensuring that the revenue is collected out of it. As much as 50% of their whatever income can go as that. When we talk about prostitution per se, we have examples and examples about it right from the earliest texts we start getting. But what is it that would make the practice more preponderant? Well, in my own understanding of it, and I find examples coming a lot from the heterodox literature, which is basically Buddhism and to some extent the Jain literature that give us an indication about it. We come across terms where the same woman who is a Vaishya, or who is a reference to a Ganika or so on, talked in Brahminical literature with a lot of derision. Well, what we find is also elements of slight compassion, and coming from none other than Buddha, the Buddha himself. He is talking about it because he refers, because we have this very famous example or the story about how Amrapali, who the term that is often used for her is Nagarvadhu, or she's also called Janpad Kalyani. She doesn't belong to one man. She is there for every, and her rate per night is also fixed. So many panyas have to be given. She is somebody who invites, even if it is, we are not 100% sure whether this happened or not, but at the level of the storytelling, she has invited the Buddha to her huge, humongous mansion. One moment. And he visits her. And then when she asks that can she enter the Sangha, she is given the permission. Which is interesting. Why? Because it's not at any point in time that Buddhism is encouraging this as a profession. That's never the case in any of the religious literature. But the Buddha seems to have understood the plight of the Vaishyas. More than that, he understood the rationale why this was happening. We are looking in the 6th century BCE at a setup where the tribal, old tribal systems are breaking. a new set of urbanism is coming up, which basically means when if you have urbanism, then you're moving away from the close knit rural familial setting, and then men are away from that, and we are looking at the Vaishya community. We're basically looking at the travelers. Then the possibility of their willing to be with a woman overnight becomes stronger. So new urban setup, and the distance the distance that has come between the man and his home may, in a sense, push him into these temporary alliances. And that is a point which the Buddha understands. He understands, but he's not saying that this is something which is fine. No, at no point is he saying that. He understands, and he also understands at some level that it may turn out to be exploitative for women when they turn old. At the time when they are in their youth, things are fine. Prostitution per se, friends, have to be understood always in contrast, or have to juxtapose to the institution of marriage. As the institution of marriage is becoming more sacrosanct, and more than marriage, it's monoandry. You see, with men, they always have the advantage of marrying a couple of times, but gradually the woman is being pushed into being in an alliance, not for just this life, the life after. So it is at that point in time that that the woman, I mean, that the only hope that you have for a woman is when she's entered into the institution of marriage. And that's the kind of, it is juxtaposed also to Janeyu ceremony. For boys, Janeyu is there. For girls, it is getting married. So when this institution has come up, anybody who is less than perfect, or anybody who for some reason is not able to enter that, with many other things coming up, things like the issue of virginity, the issue of chastity, all these concepts, the concept of maryada, which Shvetaketu comes up with. I think I'll talk about that also. If you give me a moment, I'll talk about that also. But when these issues come up, then there is a kind of a segregation between how the sexual act of a woman is going to be understood within the context of marriage, and how it will be understood outside marriage. So there are only two options open for that for women. Either she is in marriage and hence she becomes the wife, and as a wife she has certain privileges and many more responsibilities, especially of procreation. While if she could not be a part of matrimony for a number of reasons, she could have been abducted, kidnapped, especially during war, captured women, or she has become a widow, or for whatever reasons, then the only door open for her was to get into the new existence was to become a prostitute if she had to survive, if there was nobody to look after. She could be a widow and be looked after the family. She could be a widow and not looked after the family. And then even her entry into sanghas within Buddhism becomes an alternative to this matrimonial thing. But that is something that comes a little later. Before that, her existence is tied down either to a household, or she is a kulta outside the household and hence enters a life of a prostitute. Breakdown of certain social processes which give rise to this, acknowledgement of that. We're looking at the growing idea of patriarchy, where a woman's, woman has to remain committed only to one man, and where her identity is linked to her being virgin before marriage and absolutely chaste after marriage. And if she even gets raped, rape is something where she's a victim, she may be then abandoned. And what is the hope for her? What is the way that she gets, how does she survive? She may just have to become a prostitute in that. So there are reasons behind. Shvetaketu is a very well-known sage. His father is Udalak Aruni. Now, Udalak sends his son away, Shvetaketu, to study as when he was in his brahmacharya state, and when he comes back all full with knowledge, and also he further acquires it from his father also. What he sees one day is that he's chatting with his father, and enters a Brahmin in the household, and that Brahmin enters and goes straight to the mother, and the mother is dragged out of the house and is being taken away, and even within that narrative she's not very happy about it, but she's being dragged away. So Shwetaketu asks Udalak, what is this happening? And Udalak says, oh, what can I do? Women are like cows, cattle. I mean, they don't remain committed to one. They can be, many bulls can approach. So she's like that. The Brahman has come and she has gone out. And basically, you can make out that she's gone because that Brahman is interested in having a sexual act with her. Now, Shwetaketu is so angry within the myth, so angry, how dare she does that? Then he says, now I'm going to come up with the concept of Maryada. And what is this Maryada? Now, from now onwards, because he has got a lot many, he's become very powerful in terms of his spiritual acquisitions. Whatever he says will be a law unto itself. So he says, from now onwards, I declare that a woman is going to remain committed only to one man and to nobody, and that man is her husband. She will do whatever the man insists her in doing. And to the extent, if the husband says you have to sleep with XYZ, you'll have to do that. Okay, and she will not go out, because this is the only way to tame them, only way to contain them. Basic argument is that the nature of women is fickle. They can't remain committed. If you do not rein them in, right from the childhood, when she's a daughter, small young girl, and then the wife, and then mother, in case the husband is not there to be looked after son, you have to rein them in, otherwise they can go haywire. They are those who, it's almost like something which Manu tells us, that they look at a man and it's as if you're walking on the road and a man appears and the woman is going to lose her sense and is just going to go and cohabit with him. That's the kind of fear psychosis that is running into the text, which is not difficult to comprehend. Interestingly, even in traditions like Buddhism that I'm talking about, where Buddha seems to be much more kind, it is either wife or prostitute. That's the clear division that they have. And who have it? Of course, men, the mythographers of the day, were probably reflecting the kind of ideas that are current at that time. That's the kind of impression we get from reading all these texts. So the Patni, to be precise, comes center stage. She has been relegated to the background in the Vedic tradition. So she's there, but she's not so important. Somehow, by the Puranic Hinduism, the focus of the mythographers eventually became the Patni, or the Graha Lakshmi as she's called, Graha Patni as she is called, because now the Pandits are going to utilize her presence for the performance of all the vratas. The huge vratas that you had at one point in time, the Shrauta vratas, the Shrauta rituals of the Vedic time, now these are gradually giving way to the home rituals, and the woman is the center stage. In fact, she is very important now, though if you were to look, the difference between her and the prostitute, to my mind, would remain the same. It is not, that hasn't changed. You see, woman still is very, very important. A wife is still very important, because a child born out of that wife is the one who gets the status of being the connector of the lineage. So the son is very important. But who is the son? Son who's been born from an alliance which is ritually accepted. Fine, ritually accepted, that is through the sacred, the vows that have been taken at the time of marriage, and Agni being a witness out there. So Graha Patni is important. At the same time, you cannot deny, you see, when we're talking about, say, the Puranic literature, and with the Puranic literature in ancient India, if you were to correlate the time period, not before the Gupta period. Okay, so it is like 4th, 5th century CE and thereafter, because Purans, the earliest of the Purans, the Markandeya, will not come before that. in terms of writing it down. Of course, the Puranic, the floating of the narrative may have been before that also. What we find is this is a period that also coincides with the emergence of urbanism in yet another phase, fine. And we start getting references to somebody who's called Nagarika, Nagar. Somebody, it's a new terminology that comes up, which is not there in Brahminical literature earlier. You're talking about a young, handsome, urban man. Okay, when you talk about that young, handsome urban man, he's one who also requires company. Of course, the function of procreation would always be done by the wife. That is sacrosanct. That cannot, the rule cannot change. But if he needs company, then he can be in company of the Naika or the Ganika. And interestingly, that concept is receiving fillip not so much in the Puranic literature, but say in the Kamashastriya literature of the time, which is almost the parallel. If you're talking in terms of time, it's almost the parallel. Ganika is Ganika. Ganika to hey, Ganika is important. Ganika is one person who is also, right from the early literature, we get to know that she has an advantage over the Patni, and that is the advantage is that she would be taught various arts, and she also would know how to read and write. And if we were to have parallels in terms of, in terms of say Devadasi tradition, which comes almost from this time onwards, it's there. Then she also she's somebody who can be dancing, and people may be respecting her for that. At least at certain points in time, she gets that kind of respect also. But by and large, the Puranic literature would focus largely on the Patni, on the ritual woman, a woman who has been ritually incorporated within the household. And at the same time, recognize that Ganika hai, there's Ganika, there's Rupa Jiva. In fact, there's so many categories of prostitutes and sex workers that have been recognized in literature. And some of them are very, very, and Ganika is different from Vaishya. Vaishya is like a street woman. But Ganika is somebody who can also be a part of a Goshti. Goshti is like what we understand today in today's language is Mehfil. So she's probably the only person who will be entering the Goshti, and she can make very good conversation. So she's one person who's politically agile too. There may be some cases, because we come across stories where the king may ask some of, at times the wife of a minister to sleep with him, or there may be stories of where the girls, the beautiful girls brought to the court, if they are abandoned, and somebody from the from the court may get married to them. Those are examples. But by and large, these are women who are socially derided, and they have their functionality for men, but in a separate sphere. By and large, the intersectionality between the household and the other women outside, that is one who's, you will have the Vaishyavas, one who is there, a part of the Vaishyavas. That rarely happens. In Shudraka's play, of course, the wife and Vasanta Sena actually meet, and the wife thanks her because she says that you've taught the art of love making to my husband. And if you look at the story, eventually the husband goes back to the wife after having a good time spent with Vasanta Sena. He goes back, and Vasanta Sena, there was Vasanta Sena who fell in love. Because one of the rules of that is told to a prostitute by the head woman in that Vaishyavasa is never fall in love. He is a customer, and no, not beyond. You should not fall in love. And that's what we find here. She falls in love, and of course, because of it, then she realizes that ultimately the position a woman would have around the same time, talking of this period only, is a woman would be by and large confined. A Vaishya has to be confined to the Vaishyavas, and the binary continue to exist. In reality, there may be some points of intersectionality, which I will not deny, but these must be very rare examples, and certainly not condoned. Certainly. The red light area, as we call, is there even then, and it is here even now. And most of the men who are from the elite section of the society would be making use of these services. But the state acknowledges the existence. There is no doubt about it. So in some sense, the texts that are associated with the state are a little more pragmatic in their acknowledgement. The Brahminical literature, like the Dharma Shastras and Smritis, will only acknowledge them in a very negative way. Only acknowledge. So any punishment that is to be given, for that matter, if it happens to be a sex worker, it is going to be worse than the kind of punishment that would be given to a woman or any other person, for that matter. You know, if you look at the Smriti literature, and Smriti literature are the precursors to the law books today. So it starts from the Manu Samhita, Manu Smriti, right up to the Yagyavalkya, and then we have the commentaries on it, Matakshara and Jimutwan's work and so on. They are actually, if you look at from their point of view, the recognition of the trade of sex worker is there. But and in there you find that for the same kind of a punishment, the same kind of a crime, differing punishments come across. Well, a very interesting question, I would say, because I'm so glad that people have started probing into this issue, also exploring it, because somehow we have largely talked in terms of binaries, and binaries of any kind. It's easy to have the black and white and easily probe that, and the gray is not touched. Yes, you're right. In terms of if you're talking of the third gender, if I may use the term, a broad term I'm using for third gender, acknowledgement of the third gender has been there. I mean, from our point of view, myths are the ones that give us the best example for it. And the change or what I am very fond of using the term fluid masculinities, because those aspects become very evident. In the Mahabharata, we have very interesting example of Shikhandi, who's Amba in the previous birth and has come back primarily to settle account with Bhishma Pitama, or for that matter, Arjun turning as a Brinnalla in order to enter the precincts of where Draupadi is in the Virat Parvan. So we have occasional examples of the possibility of the third gender, and the reference to what is called Tritiya Prakriti. The term is called Tritiya Prakriti, the third gender. Clearly it is called the third gender. Interestingly, you have reference to this not just in the Brahminical literature, you have extensive work done on in the Jain literature and even in the Buddhist literature. All the three dabble with it, all the three. If you're talking in terms of identification, let me give you a very interesting example. How do you make out whether you're going to have a child who's going to be third gender? To that extent, thinking and explorations go on. If the son would always be on the right side of the womb, the daughter would always be on the left side of the womb. And if it is the center that is being protruded, it has to be the child would be that of the third gender. It's something that is coming in Mahabharata. It is something that is coming in so many literature, of the time. Jain literature, as I said, gives you maximum examples. Mahabharata also talks about it, and Kama Shastri literature talks about it specifically in the context of sexual act. So Tritiya Prakriti, about which Kama Sutra deals in detail, gives us an idea of an actual relationship between two men, and one person, one of these, the third gender, has manushi predilections, in the sense towards the female side. So there is a possibility that he dresses up like a female. He may be a male, but dresses up like a female to allure the man. And interestingly, and so what we find is that within the third gender, Tritiya Prakriti, we start getting references, details about those, the Tritiya Prakriti who are like men, Tritiya Prakriti who are like women. So within that, certain binaries are coming up within this, and a relationship, and this man of Tritiya Prakriti is actually equated to a woman. One of the ways in which Jains decided not to let a man enter, they don't have problems with which caste you are from before you can enter into the Sangha. Caste is not a factor at all there, but there are other factors. One of the factors is that they should not by any chance give entry to a homosexual or person, because this is going to spoil the milieu within the Sangha. That is the fear. And so they have huge tests, in the sense they keep on asking questions. What is it? Why have you decided to come to, and they'll ask twisted questions, decided to come to the Sangha? And you have to be truthful, tell the reason. And one of the reasons the person would say is because, it could be like that, or they may have that I had sex with another man and I feel guilty about it. To purge that sense of guilt, I want to enter the Sangha. And that becomes a reason. तो वेदना आपकी जो है वो मानुषी हो गई थी. That means you behave like a woman in a relationship with a man, and so you are not. And so you're feeling guilty, and you want to now enter Sangha, because entry into Sangha means that you have to lead a asexual existence. But the interesting part is that before you enter into the Sangha, the test is taken whether you can have that Vedana or not, or do you have that kind of inclination or not. Dravya, fluid, what kind of prakriti do you have? What kind of desires do you have? Because if you entertain, and the belief, and this is a belief that if you are a homosexual or a person of Tritiya Prakriti, you can never have a control over your sexual desires. It is the kind of sexual desire within the Jain tradition they talk about. If you have that of the third gender or Tritiya Prakriti, it has so much of heat within it that it can put a city on fire. Manusmriti has, I think this is in the 9th chapter, if I'm not mistaken, talks about, and again Manusmriti is like a book on punishments. It will tell you, if this and this happens, then this is the punishment. If this happens, this happens. So punishments may, if a woman, and I'm talking of lesbian relationship, if a woman cohabits with another woman, what is going to be the punishment? So there also categories are there. Interesting, I'm talking about categories, detailing and nuances. If she is a married woman and she has a relationship with the virgin, then the virgin has to pay so much of panas, but the married woman has to pay extra. And she's not going to pay, the men in the family are going to pay. And that becomes the reason why you must rein in your women. So if it is between two virgins, then this is the panas, this is the punishment. If it is between so and so. And if a woman is going out, obviously woman will not go out and have a relationship with a prostitute in that sense. So you don't have reference to that, but you have clear reference to the fact that a woman-woman relationship is in existence, and the fact that there are punishments specified for it means that it is obviously not encouraged. This is supposed to be discouraged, but it is acknowledged. It is there. So you have many examples of existence of homosexual relations, of existence of how you must keep away from them. If you were to look at the spiritual literature, what are the ways of testing, keeping yourself off from it? Why and how do you make out a child from the child, what is the child interested in? So you can make out what is the predilection and then take action right then. The fact that the recognition of many sexualities is there, but the condoning of only the binaries is there. You're only going to accept the binaries, that it's a man or a woman, and the relation, the ideal sexual relationship is heterosexual relationship. And this cuts across all the traditions of ancient India. That is what I have read actually. So it cuts across. So that is where you condone it, where you accept it, acknowledge it, but you certainly acknowledge the existence of numerous sexualities. It is not singular or just